always been very interested in animals and have a lot of animals when I was a little child. So I think it was natural for me to go into biology and learn more about animals. And after that I got interested in animal behavior, especially the interaction between physiology and behavior, which then control the responses of animals. My name is Jens Malmkvist. I'm professor in applied ethology, and ethology is the study of animal behavior. My research within animal behavior has included a range of different species, such as horses, pigs, cats, mink, and so on. This also includes things like stress responses and welfare of animals. This work can be used, for example, when farmers want to optimize the condition they provide for their animals, but it can also be used for legislation, want to make new rules for how we are going to keep animals. I hope to achieve a better understanding of animal states, in understanding what is positive and what is negative from the animal point of view. And I think this main target is so we better can understand how we can optimize the production of animals, how we can optimize the performance, and finally how we can provide good welfare conditions for animals. One major motivation for me as a researcher is curiosity. I think this is a driving force for many of us researchers. But I also like the applied thing about it, that we try to solve real problems in the real world.
Welcome, Jens.
Thank you very much.
How can we ask animals about their feelings?
Yes, this is a very interesting question. We also heard this morning from Annabelle, the professor, saying that we want to ask the animals because we want to understand it. And I completely agree what she said, that we can objectively try to measure the behavior of the animal, look at how they respond. And sometimes it's of course very easy. If you walk in the streets in Uppsala and there's a dog attacking you, of course you can then recognize this is an aggressive dog or a fleeing animal. Then you have a very easy way to determine the state and the mental and emotion of the animal. But sometimes, as we also heard today, how to really differentiate with things like pain and stress, we need to look very carefully. And we also have to develop methods for more longer things. And I will address that a bit during the talk.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I understand that your research hasn't specifically focused on dairy cows, but let's consider the proposal to remove the pasture requirement as an example, beteskravet för kor. Det debatteras ju nu. And as an ethologist, and in the light of this proposal, what kinds of questions do you think we should be asking to ensure a fair assessment, one that balances animal welfare with economic and competitive concerns in agriculture?
Yeah, it's of course a huge question.
Yeah,
but I would think as an ethologist, I will still address the thing about taking the animal point of view, try to understand, because you and me and others can have, they should have outdoor access, and other people say, no, they don't need it. But we have to go to the animal and ask them indirectly. And what we can do is like, what is happening in groups of cows? What kind of behavior do they have when they have access or not? What are the stress reactions? What kind of behavior are they able to do in the accommodation they have? And the same is true, for example, when you have outdoor animals, we look also about whether they need shelter. So it's not like either or, we have to look at what kind of responses do they have.
Yeah.
And for example, one thing as an ethologist we need to remember is that having a choice is often a value. So having that the animal have agency to choose something during the day, now I want to be in this compartment, now I want to use these resources, is often something which will have a value. So these are the kind of questions I will look at, looking at stress responses of cows as well, comparing groups of cows. And then, of course, you are right, it will be a trade-off often, but we need the knowledge before we can make this decision, I will say. Yeah.
Please tell us more about your research. And I would like to introduce Jens Malmkvist, Professor of Applied Ethology, talking about animal behavior, the key to understanding the animal mind.
Thank you. I would like to invite you into the field of animal behavior. And today we will focus on domestic animals. And during this talk you will meet the rooting pig, you will meet the social horse, and you will also meet the vocalizing mink. So be prepared. And I will give some example, which I hope for you will illustrate how and why we can use animal behavior in practice and in research to answer some questions. But first, before we get to that, I would like to address some important points. The first one being, of course, that animal behavior is related to how the animal function in the nature. So we have a clear link. You can say the animal mind, what's on the mind, what's the intention, the motivation is linked to some kind of function in nature, illustrated by these pigs rooting. This is the rooting pig. So this is a part of natural foraging behavior in pigs, done in wild pigs as well as our domestic pigs. So we have a link here directly where we can use the behavior to see what kind of motivation and intention is within this animal. Another point to make here is that although we have kept animals for thousands of years and have, of course, changed some of the thresholds for reaction, when we take one step back and look at the fundamentals, basically animal needs and motivation are largely unchanged. Of course, there are changes in morphology, there are changes in thresholds of reaction, fearfulness, for example, social tolerance. However, when we look at a species, let's take the social horse, for example. The modern horse is still a social animal, prefer living in a group, and use a lot of the daily time grazing if they are given the chance to do so. So we have here two dogmas, you can say, which I will ask you to remember in the following. And this is also why I suggest that behavior and the stress response of the full functional animal is one way which we can ask the animal and look into the animal mind. What's on the mind? What's the intention? What are the needs? And now to some example of this. Of course, we all know there are a lot of factors which influence animals, and I have been lucky to be involved in many different kinds of study looking into how animals are affected by, for example, genetic selection. During my PhD, I did studies finding out that you are able to, for example, create mink which have a lower level of fear, which have experienced less stress, and which are more curious and thus better adapted to the system current there was. But it's also evident that what the animal experienced during the life, how we house them, how we manage them, of course, have a huge influence on the state of the animal, whether they are in a negative state or in a positive state, for example. Before getting on with examples, I want to state one thing, which I think is maybe sometimes is a bit overlooked, and this is about the senses and the perception of the animal. We cannot take for granted that the animal senses and perception are the same as ours, of course not. And as humans, we are very vision-based, and that's why today I have brought a lot of pictures for you. So even though you may be a bit bored, you have something nice to look at in between. But this is typically completely different from the animals we would like to understand and study. And also the perception of situation. I would like to pet my cat on the top of the head, but maybe that's not something which are perceived as nice for the animal. So this is something I will address in a minute, why we need to also remember that when we talk about understanding the animal mind. They have a different set of senses and perceptions often. Another step, you could say, you sit here and come all this way to Sweden to listen to me, some of you, and say, why should we even care about what's on the animal mind? But in my perspective, there are at least three, I think, very good reasons. The first one being what I talk about, the film basic curiosity. We as humans are interested in the world that's around us. That's part of our success, that we really want to understand the animal we are surrounded with. Why is the dog reacting as it is? Why is the horse doing this and that? So basic animal understanding is a driving force. Secondly is, of course, animal welfare. To be able to understand whether animals are in a negative or in a positive state or in between is an essential part in the modern understanding of animal welfare, which is centered on the animal experience of the situation. So, for example, is this painful for the animal? Are they in a negative state or are they happy and content, for example? And finally, animal behavior and stress responses are often used also in increasing performance. And we have excellent talk today also about how performance of animals can relate to understanding the animal. And we all know, for example, temperament in horses can be very important for how much they can learn and how dangerous they can be to interact with. That's some examples. For the farmer, having low stress also, and the behavior of animals also influence some of the production efficiency. If you have high levels of stress, this can cost growth, it can cost reproduction, for example. And there are a lot of examples in real life. Yes, that was some theory. Now I would like to give you some examples to spice it up a bit. And I also would like to challenge your imagination. Try to imagine you right now are standing in the middle of a mink farm. We are now the 9th of May, so it's around 10 days ago is the peak of the birth season. So around you there are hundreds of animals and a lot of noises. So if you go on a mink farm now, you will recognize a lot of small sounds and squeaks and funny noises. And this is very, very obvious if you ever have been there. And what we did in a study together with others was to see what kind of callings, what kind of signals, what kind of senses and perceptions are in these mink. And what we actually found out, looking carefully into it, was that these mink kids, one picture here, are emitting sounds above the range that we are able to hear as humans. So, and this was something completely novel. And this means, in a way, you can say that these mink have a secret language. They are emitting sounds of something we cannot hear as humans or the farmers taking care of them. When we then started to look closer into what they can perceive themselves, measuring the activity in the hearing nerves of young animals, then we found out they were actually not able to hear it themselves. They are functional deaf for the first week of life. And this was also something nobody knew before. After 4 weeks, the hearing ability gradually develops, so they are able to hear it. And then they stop nearly vocalizing. So you can say the mink kid do not like to hear all this noise they emit themselves. But this is, of course, because these sounds are not directed. They're not directed to us as humans. They're not directed to themselves. It's, of course, directed to the mother. They stay with the mother for the first 8 weeks of life. So here's one example of things which we found out. Then we look to the mother side of the story. When we read in textbooks, it says that mink are able to hear up to 40,000 kilohertz. Pretty good, like a cat. Cats can hear even better, but still. So we were quite surprised. Why should then a mink kid deliver a sound up to 50 kilohertz? But when we actually measured it with modern equipment, we were able to identify they can actually hear much, much higher sounds. They can hear above 70 kilohertz. And that was the limit of our equipment. We used equipment for bats. And that was, at that time, the maximum we could reach up. So this is an example, and now all the students should not listen to me, but you shouldn't always trust the textbook. You have sometimes to test it. But when we look more into these details, we found out that this secret language of mink is a signal of need. It stimulates the maternal care of the mother. And also another thing about the mother cognition, they are actually able to recognize the young based on the sounds. And that's really, we cannot really explain why this have evolved, but on a farm that's helpful because they are housed in close proximity, meaning that they only react to their own young and not to ones beside them. So that's maybe why. But this is just to illustrate some of the fine-tuned mechanisms you can find out when you look into the animal behavior. And of course, from a production perspective, this is also important for farmers because they want growth, they want survival. And some of these studies can help farmers to provide a better conditions for the animals so we have a better production and thus economy as well. This was just one example, and I'm fully aware that mink production will probably not be a large thing here in Sweden. It will not. But many of these stories we can find and investigate also the other animals, and then we have to take senses perception into account, and we have to take the capacity of the animal into account. Not taking for granted that our senses and our perception are the one which we should believe in. We should be cautious. Yes. Another field which I've been very interested over the year is maybe more a dark side. It's about what is happening when animals are not able to perform motivated, which they're really behaviors which they're really motivated to do. For example, foraging and stuff like that. When they are thwarted in the motivation, and then it can happen that development of abnormal behavior. And I've illustrated that with broken glass, because something is broken with the animals, and they do this kind of thing like pulling out hair, fur chewing, feather pecking, tail biting, or you see the pacing in zoological garden or in farm animals. You all know these kind of behaviors, and we term them abnormal behavior. They can be present, but abnormal because they are not seen in nature at all. So it's something inflicted upon them. So this is a field I have been worked something with. And often in husbandry or how we keep animals, we treat the symptoms. It could be beak trimming. We could put on a nose ring to prevent the cow to suckle on another one. We could tail duck, still allowed in some countries to reduce the problems with tail biting. Put on a strap to hinder the horse to crib biting. Spray something on to if there's excessive licking, which can be abnormal but can be caused by other things, or put in apparatus which hinder the animals to do it. Of course, this is a quick fix, and we have heard earlier today that it's easier to make the quick fix than solve the problem. Of course it is. But you have to remember that the motivation and what the animals are telling us is still the same, even though we have symptom treated this. And we did a range of study now again with the mink example, where you can reduce abnormal behavior and stress responses. For example, by this kind of biting rope, which the animal really want to use up to foraging. They can pull from one to another, and then they have movement. So these kind of things can be done. And we have, of course, tested a range of things which actually works, such as platforms, more structure and feeding in the active periods of the animal, provide them with running wheels. All these things in a barren environment actually improved animal welfare by reducing abnormal behavior, by reducing stress responses. We can see it here. If you were the farmer who have to pay for this, you will say, yeah, but this is also very costly. And you're right. These are costly intervention. So it will bring a cost upon the product, whether it's a mink coat or whether it's a poultry or any animal. But I also would say that knowledge is important here, because you can risk legislators or others say, I think they should have this or that. And this list is a positive list. You have to believe me, we have tried many, many other things who didn't make the list, where there was no effect. Also costly investment for the farmers, but had no effect at all. One example being, if you just enlarge the area for the mink or just give them a barren thing, it has no effect at all. You have to have something effect. So in that way, you can say knowledge is valuable also, so you don't make the wrong choices. One side story here will be short, but where we collaborated with the people studying brains, and we were actually able, I think it's for the first time, investigating farm animals to see on novel cell formation in hippocampus. And what we found here was that mink, being very active, also have a much healthier brain in terms of novel cells in hippocampus. And this is a region which are involved in memory and learning. And if you heard the first talk today, talking much about we should be active and moving, and you can say some sort of the same thing is probably on play here, that active animals have healthier brain, at least in this aspect. But this can, of course, point at something we maybe need to look more into. And this is a field which I want to pursue more together with other researchers here in Europe, is looking into what about the inactive animals. Because sometimes it's easy, whether you have a acute, quick situation, but if you have low aroused situation where we have a pig laying quiet, are they bored or are they actually sleeping in happiness? So what's the situation here? And then it's much more difficult to actually look into positive and negative aliens. So we need to develop novel methods in this. So I think this is a task which we have to address. And one of the things we can do, I think, is to use some of the integrative measures, not look so much at the acute responses, but use things like fragmented sleep, cyclicity, whether the animal have a natural rhythm. And these are some of the things we know, for example, that stressors over long time can disrupt sleep patterns. So this is something I would like to here at SLU also go into more details to investigate. And the second last slide is about a study we also did, just to show you, we go from maybe very academic thing looking into brain cells, but also looking in practical development. This is a hut which a very active farmer and a company developed, and they asked us, would you like to be involved looking into what kind of things should we put in this farrowing hut? And actually it's quite rewarding to be able to use some of this knowledge we have, in this case about young piglets, on how we actually can accommodate, because there is surplus piglet mortality when they are housed in this organic outdoor production. But how can we solve it? And some things they put in the hut actually make it worse for the animals. But who should know? We need to measure it, right? But some things make it better. For example, even in the hut, warm Denmark, if there was heated areas in this hut, it's actually proved to be beneficial for the piglets. So it can be cold even in Denmark, believe it or not. This is my last slide. And here I also want to make a note of collaboration, because I think all what I have presented today has been in research groups. It has been in collaboration with, for example, neuroscientists. It has been with collaboration with companies, with farmers, and also many times with PhD students and students which are helping out. So you have to remember that this is really a collaboration thing. So when we are going to sleep, we need to, for example, collaborate with people working, are expert in some of the methods. For example, engineers who have developed novel, non-invasive methods for this. But I think many of the ways we keep animals will change. But one thing is for sure, that we domestic animals will remain an important part of our life as humans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jens. Very interesting to listen to you. And you are welcome with your questions. And if you want to email a question, the address is nyaprofessorer@slu.se. Jag börjar med en egen fråga. I'll start with a question on my own. Yeah, so you
can be in Swedish.
Yeah, well, we continue in English, I think. You state at the end of the film that you like to solve real problems in the real world, and I think you gave us some examples. But could you say something more about that? Give us an example.
Yes, I can. For example, I think this about the interaction between mother and young and the importance for mortality. I think this is particularly rewarding when you can understand the animal. It could be the sow and the piglet, and then can provide the farmer with a solution, saying, if you want a short farrowing time, you can provide them with straw, and you should do this and that, or you shouldn't, all this kind of thing. When you have the whole chain from theory and into you can stand with the farmer, and the farmer can report back, actually this year we have improved on a survival rate, and we have growth, and we have less disease. That's really satisfying.
Have you been in such a situation?
Yes, I have.
Was this that kind of example? Or?
Yeah, I have, for example, take the mink example, where nobody really have filmed a birth of mink, and nobody really know, and they actually had problems. It was quite easy to address some issues about nesting material, and that actually could reduce the mortality with several proportions. It doesn't seem much for 1 litter, but if you multiply it in a production, also out of sustainability, because it's costly to produce animals and you use energy, so you shouldn't waste too much. Another thing is, of course, the legislation. When you provide knowledge which are integrated in legislation, we have this about selecting for temperament, which came into the law on how you should keep animal, that you should include breeding criteria which are not only production-wise in the Danish law, and that was, I think, something which came into it. But it's going when you go out on farms or you go out in zoological garden for for such sake. The input you get and the problem is also getting into research, because many of the good questions are actually out there. So that's how it is. Yeah.
Any questions? Yeah, we have 2 questions over there.
Thank you very much, Jens. And I promised not to ask a genomics question, so I ask a more or less philosophical one, actually, and that is, you named it already, selection for temperament. So, but also we have the legislation to provide the ability to choose and to express natural behavior. So, to what degree can we use artificial selection to select against behaviors that we cannot cater for in any case?
Thank you for this good question, and thank you for not mentioning genomics. I think it's a central point. It's really a central point. In many ways, we do artificial intent selection now, which affect the animal ability to perform natural behavior. You can say the growth. You can take turkey, which are so big, so they are not able to move, even though they are motivated to do so. So we already now we do that. And then you ask, so I think we should have a broader selection criteria where we also include this kind of the ability to perform. I would not go so far to say natural behavior, but to say normal behaviors, because a lot of behavior in nature are actually linked to things which to defend the animal against predators, for example. It's not like we want all natural behaviors to be present in a housing system. So we should, of course, avoid the negative parts. It's not like it's completely natural to flee and have stress reactions, completely natural, but that's not something we want to promote in our system. On the other side, we want to protect the animal from this, but still we want not to have such a narrow selection that we remove the potential of the animal to react. And actually, exactly this, we are in a project working on that, looking on whether pigs, which are fast growing in the slaughter situation, in the slaughter stable, have the same urge to go for foraging, for example. Are there a genetic correlation and a behavioral correlation between eating and sleeping and growing and still wanting to root and perform this positive natural behavior? So I think this is something which is central on how would we balance the selection pressure, at least in our production animals, with the need of them being able to experience positive lives. So you can enrich the lives, but if they're not able to use it, it is of no, it's waste of money and time.
Thank you. We have another question.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. It was also very interesting. We have heard several times today that animals can't talk, so we have hard times understanding what they want. What about the other way around? Can the animals understand us?
It's a good question about the interaction. And of course, some of these domestication had provided animals which are really good at understanding humans. And even the cat example where they modify their natural vocalization pattern. So what we hear as a meow is actually a way they try to manipulate the humans. It's not something that the cats would do normally. It's just trying to beg for you. So there is an interaction here. And of course, each farmer would know that when they start feeding, they are very good in looking at signals. So in that way, you are right. And I also say this about whether the animal can talk or not. In my world, they can talk in a way, but we just have to tune into the frequency, so to say. And also, if you look at me, do you exactly know how I feel if I say I'm good or I'm not good? We also look at or humans. We know that children who don't have a language also have feelings, and we know elderly people or other who have a stroke. Still, you have the feeling, you have the brain involved in emotions, right? So we cannot rely on spoken language. But thank you for the question.
One final question. Do you think that modern technology will reveal more hidden languages between animals, as you showed us with a mink?
I think there's the potential, because you have the possibility. When I started studying, we look at video or we look at animals. But now if you have 400 pigs in a group and they are freely roaming, now with modern technology, we have sensors on them and we can use digital imaging and all this kind of thing. So it is an opportunity, but it also can be a pitfall if we, for example, are afraid of, if we are not standing on a solid ground on the interpretation. If we, for example, say, they're inactive, they're good, but are they really? So we have to remember to look into validation, but then I think we have splendid tools in the future, actually, to follow this.
Good luck with your research, and thank you very much.
Welcome.